but I think that any of those ways of like thinking about subjectivity sort of limit us when it comes to interacting with God or reading the scripture. And I think it's the Psalms in particular that helps us recover, I guess, what we might call a kind of scriptural subjectivity. So by that, I mean that we don't like exclude the physical or the cognitive or the affective, like all those things are definitely part of the human experience. But I think what Psalms show us is that subjectivity, human subjectivity is fundamentally relational.
Mm.
That what makes us who we are as beings and what kind of is at the core of our interaction with the world is our capacity for relationality, specifically for relating to God, which I think in the Psalms is presented as like the fundamental relationship. So,
And that's, I mean, I just want to mention one thing, because if you realize then that when Christ says that, you know, let's say all the commandments are gathered in to love God and love your neighbor, what's being enunciated there in some ways is not just an ethical command. It's not just the way that you have to act, but the way we have to be, that it's an enunciation of what it means to be a being in itself, that a being has to be in relation to others. That's how it works.
right. So like, how do we move from the kind of domain of the self to something outside the self, I guess is a question. And do we do it on the basis of, again, our emotions, our cognitive maneuvers or whatever? I think the Psalms kind of anchor us in something deeper and kind of a deeper way to make that movement that is, you know, fundamentally a movement of love. So I was kind of helped in my reflections by this distinction that philosopher Charles Taylor makes, right, between two models of the self, right? So he talks about something called the porous self, which he associates with, you know, pre-modern cultures, right? So where people didn't sort of draw this hard line between themselves and the world outside, but saw the boundary as porous. And so things that happen in the world essentially can be experienced in this sort of direct way. There isn't like a wall, so to speak. And so this, he says, goes along with experiencing the world in an enchanted way, right? So that we see we're kind of porous to the spirits, we're porous to cosmic forces, we're porous to God. And that in this mode, you know, along with that is actually a kind of vulnerability, right? So you have people who are sort of feel vulnerable to spiritual forces. And so one of the things that Taylor's interested in is like what it means for us to be modern people, right? And he says that one of the hallmarks of modernity is a kind of shift from this idea of the porous self, where we are kind of feel ourselves as being connected to and vulnerable to that which is outside of us, to what he calls the buffered self. So when he speaks of the buffered self, he's sort of talking about a model of the self in which we have like complete control over the meanings we assign to the world. So we can kind of stand back, observe things, and decide what they mean. And we have this sort of buffer then that insulates us from what happens to us. And so not only do we have sort of control over the meanings we assign to things in the world, but he says that people, you know, see this as liberative because it gives them freedom. Like I can assign whatever meanings I want. I can kind of remake myself as I like. And I think of Richard Rorty in connection with this because, you know, he's the one who sort of celebrated our kind of Nietzschean potential to recreate ourselves. And, you know, he says, he has this quote, he says, "There's nothing deep down inside us except what we have put there ourselves." So it's a kind of buffered self. And behind the buffer is this container that's completely at our disposal.
Yeah.
So I think this kind of modern view of selfhood, and, you know, I have to say, to a great degree, is kind of the view that I walk around with, you know, as a function of, you know, living when and where I do. And it makes it hard to kind of relate to that which is on the other side of the buffer, if you know what I mean, if you're kind of experiencing yourself in this particular way.
But it's interesting that now, because that way of thinking, especially online, especially the fact that we're physically separated from each other and we interact through screens, it's as if there's an acceleration of this, like a notion of the buffered self is manifesting itself in the world and accelerated even in the means by which we interact, like you and I right now interacting through this screen. And so the consequences of it are more visible, right? If you think of avatar culture, like this idea of people self-creating themselves online through their personas that have become very strange, and like they can even be aliens or furries or whatever. Like people will self-create themselves in ways that have become so idiosyncratic that it's almost now impossible not to notice the side effects of this buffered self. Like it's fragmenting and splintering in ways that, in some ways, I think is opening a call of the heart of people wanting something more, wanting a more connected reality.
No, I think that's an excellent point. I do think that digital stuff and screens sort of are in a way a kind of buffer, right? Like that's just the version of the buffer that we're kind of working with today. And also the thing about the digital is that it really has this idea of plasticity and kind of infinite potential, and you can rearrange and reconfigure endlessly. And so this idea that the kind of stuff that we work with behind the buffer is infinitely plastic is, I think, part of you could just reuse, use and reuse cultural tropes and memes and, this bit of song and this image, and you can just sort of put it all together and create whatever you want. But I think what the Psalms point to when it comes to subjectivity is this idea that it's not infinitely plastic. There is actually something there that is God-given, that can only really be at rest and fulfilled when we come back into communion with God. So I think Rorty is wrong. There's more than down in there than what we put there. Namely, there is what God put there. And I think it's the Psalms that in this really unique way kind of tutor us. They kind of like lead us in this sort of manner of living that reconnects us, I think, with a notion of the self that's not fragmented, as to use your word, but actually kind of reintegrated